this is a fascinating story that has to go in the timeline. The Second Reich, which led to the Third Reich. What was going on in Germany, you could argue the late 20s, the early 30s, leading up to 1940s in Germany. There was a lot going on pre-Third Reich in terms of the mentality, in terms of the general attitude which led to the Third Reich.
In the first years of the 20th century, all the racial theories developed in the Victorian age, eugenics, social Darwinism and scientific racism, came together in a forgotten outpost of colonialism.
Its most gaping open wound is what has been dubbed the first genocide of the 20th century. In 1904, German colonizers attempted to wipe out the Herero and Nama ethnic groups, massacring up to 110,000 people.
If I were to have to use the language of the Nazi period, then I would certainly see Shark Island as a death camp.
The Aryan crap may become a little later on, but this was here in the early 1900s.
You have this memorial sponsored by the German government, which quite incredibly says that the people who perished under mysterious circumstances. I mean, adding insult to injury is really an understatement here.
I started looking. There was a lot of interesting facts. The one interesting fact that really slapped me in the kipper, it got me onto something that I'd never known, never even heard of, called Shark Island. I don't know whether anyone knows about that.
The Germans committed innumerable massacres and atrocities, but they were unable to hunt down and destroy all the Herero people across such a vast landscape. And when the Nama, another of the Namibian peoples, rose up, the Germans turned instead to a recent invention, the concentration camp.
Shark Island was established for the express purpose of killing people. Anybody placed on that island, everybody knew they were going to die. People knew that, the German officers knew that.
The story of the German extermination of the Herero and the Nimamba peoples has been expunged from the history books, and the tourists and the scuba divers on the Shark Bay waterfront will find no mention of it in their guides.
In these camps, the Herero and Nama were imprisoned and enslaved. Thousands were worked to death, others raped, beaten, or simply murdered by the guards. The most infamous and deadly of the camps was at a place called Shark Island.
The biggest sellout has been the neoliberal constitution that was adopted. It was an outward-looking constitution that ignores the history and suffering of our people.
If you want to avoid a neo-colonial scenario, you must pay as much attention to economic liberation as you need to pay to political liberation. And neither we did it nor the ANC in South Africa. The political leadership of the former liberation movement, now ruling party, increasingly got comfortable with corporate power and with business elites.
I wanted to do a video on this topic, not because it's the most important thing in the world, but for me, it's something that has to be put in the mix in terms of the German timeline, their history, their mentality, and what them sick fucks was doing from 1900 all the way to the 1940s, where they were thinking what the mentality was all about and the way they felt they could degrade anyone if it furthered their own cause. Their own cause.
The memory of what German occupiers did to their ancestors still haunts them.
the Germans came, or the whites came, to took all the men out. Understand? So they were put on a ship, and this ship went into the oceans, and then they disappeared. I mean, there was a blast, boom, like that, and that men never returned back.
The genocides which took place in Namibia in 1904 to 1909, they are the precursor to what happens in the Nazi period. They are the precursor. They have the same symptoms in the sense that you can see the bureaucratization of mass killing. And this, for me, is the central thing. It's not just killing for killing. No. It's a combination between killing and bureaucracy.
The territory which a group, stroke state or nation believes it is needed for natural development.
However, German colonial groups and British interest in the region encouraged the Germans to set up a new colony, Southwest Africa. Over the next few years it expanded greatly. For instance, during the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty with Britain, the Germans were able to annex the Caprivi Strip, and in 1892, Kurt von Francois founded Swakopmund.
Over 100 years ago, there was a genocide that took place here against the Herero and the Nama, which many people are still learning more about.
There's more to this.
Here in Swakopmund, there are actually 3 concentration camps, and where we're standing right now is home to many of the bones of the ancestors of the concentration camp victims. And as you're walking around this barren plot of land, you actually can find bones just kind of strewn about. And we were walking here for all of 5 minutes and found human remains just kind of lying in the sand.
In a recently discovered mass grave, just a few kilometers from the site of Shark Island, lie some of the victims of the 20th century's first genocide. Other victims were denied even the meager dignity of a mass grave. They became the raw material of racial science. Their skulls, and even severed heads, were sold to museums in Europe and used to prove the inferiority of Africans. The trade in skulls was so accepted that it was even depicted on a postcard.
which you can actually find a lot of here in Swakopmund, which is really kind of interesting because you have this contrast of these beautiful houses that are right behind me, right in front of me over there, and then this kind of barren landscape which just houses the bones of the genocide victims.
There's an actual terminology that justified this in their head, which then they took this same template and then used it against not only the German people, but the Jews, whether they were Polish, whether they were Roman, Gypsy, whatever.
Both von Epp and Fischer were proponents of the theory of Lebensraum, or living space, that was central to Nazi ideology, a theory that justified land grabbing for the white race. And so historians say it was the genocide in Namibia that laid the blueprint for the European Holocaust.
When you consider that that plays a big part into what this is classed as the Second Reich, so this mentality, Second Reich, then led on to the Third Reich. So Hitler only embraced this, he put charisma on it, he made it fashionable, he made it workable to his people. What people, very little people, know is that they were doing that in other countries, unbeknown. I mean, at this same time, I'm looking at diagrams that are clearly showing me at this period how Africa was carved up. It was carved up by so many different countries that wanted to extract the minerals, wanted to colonialize it, yeah? You know, I'm not blaming and castigating anyone. I'm just saying in terms of the Third Reich.
In the 19th century, Namibia was made up of many ethnic groups, like the Bantu Uvambu people in the north, who lived almost isolated from the rest of the country. Otherwise, there were the Ualam, who were largely a mix of natives, Europeans and slaves brought from different parts of Africa, and they built a church in Windhoek and settlements elsewhere. And the Ualam often fought with the Herero people, who were herders living in central Namibia, and in the second half of the 19th century were led by Maherero. And there's the Nama people, hunter-gatherers mainly in the south, and they often fought with the Herero and Ualam.
Africa was good to go. Good to fucking go. And if we're going to be honest, probably they wasn't the only country with that type of mentality, colonialist mentality, innit?
As for the Europeans, although the Portuguese had established some settlements in Namibia centuries before, they were largely abandoned by the 19th century. But during the scramble for Africa, the British established themselves in Walvis Bay, and a German trader, Adolf Luderitz, bought land in 1883 on the coast from an Ualam captain named Joseph Fredericks II. Luderitz tricked the Ualam into selling more land than they desired, and he initially had little support from the new German Empire, because Bismarck saw colonies as too costly to maintain.
And I'm not trying to throw a guilt trip here, I'm just saying it's the timeline of history. With Germany thinking like that, with them thinking that black people are subhuman, because when you scratch into what was going on in Shark concentration camp, there was a whole different manner of eugenical experiments carried out on these individuals.
He experimented on the decapitated heads of the Herero and Nama people to try to justify his theory of white supremacy.
When I say the concentration camp come at the end, what come at the beginning was the persecution, the hunting, the toxifying of water holes, because don't forget, these are tribes. These were nomadic tribes that relied on water holes, just like today, your nomadic tribes.
However, Trota pursued them, forcing the Herero to march into the desert where many died, but some did manage to escape into British-controlled regions. And in October, Trota declared that any Herero found within German borders would be shot. He defended his actions based on racial grounds.
Acknowledgement has got to be key. It's got to be put in the timeline. That's got to be key. You can't just start from Adolf Hitler. You can't. Because Adolf Hitler wasn't even in power when this was going on.
While Germany continues to struggle with atoning for the Holocaust, its officials are still refusing to recognize German crimes committed against the Herero and Nama people as genocide. Prominent Nazis such as Ritter von Epp and Eugen Fischer were involved in the atrocities in Namibia. Von Epp is considered by many to be the ideological godfather of the early Nazi Party, and Eugen Fischer was a pioneering eugenicist whose ideas inspired Hitler.
Eugen Fischer, a future member of the Nazi Party, carried out experiments on mixed-race people. His work was studied by the likes of Joseph Mengele, and it was influential to the Nazis' Nuremberg race laws.
While white ownership of land never changed here after German and South African colonization ended, since the country's independence, the Namibian leadership itself has overseen the sell-off of the country's resources, like water, to Europeans.
When you look at the migrant situation, where so many Africans are moving from African countries to Europe in search of a better life, it's a shame that a continent that is as rich as Africa today is, has a migrant problem. While the very countries they run to for a better life are the countries whose companies are making the largest profits in this continent. What a contradiction.
The camps were closed down in 1907, but the surviving natives were banned from owning land and livestock. Although the numbers are disputed, around 65,000 people are estimated to have been killed during this period. So 80% of the Herero population and 50% of the Nama population were killed.